Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I should start out by saying that this video took a couple of months to make. I started making the quilt at the end of March and finished it the end of May. If you've been with me for a while, then you'll know that a couple of months ago I made a quilt, a baby quilt, in anticipation of the birth of my grandchild in July. I figured I had a 50-50 chance on the gender, and so I made a quilt for a baby girl. And then we found out that my daughter was having a boy. So this is the quilt pattern that I found on the YouTube channel Fabric Cafe that I want to make for my grandson. Here I am at 35th Avenue Fabric World in Phoenix to look for some fabric for my grandbaby's quilt. I don't really have a plan, I just want to see what they have. And this is what I came up with. I've arranged it in the order that I'm going to use it. This fabric will border the outside of the quilt in a 4-inch border. The fabric line is Rootin' Tootin' by Michael Miller Fabrics. And this fabric's name is Happy Trails. And I love the little horseshoes and sheriff stars, hats and boots on it. This is called Vintage Bandana, and I may use it for a 1-inch border and the 8-inch squares. This fabric is called Saddle Up, and it is so cute with the hats and the boots. I plan to make 8-inch squares out of this and also use it for the back. This fabric is called Giddy Up, and I purchased it as a fat quarter. I may not or may have enough of this, I don't know yet, but I plan to make 4-inch squares out of it. This one is called Rawhide Stripes. And I also purchased this and several other colors in fat quarters. Here's the navy blue and burnt orange in that rawhide stripe pattern. I got these not knowing what pattern I was going to use, and so I'll probably, or I will, leave them for a different project. So I'm starting by cutting 4.5-inch strips out of the burnt orange fabric, and I'm using my guide or my ruler and my rotary cutter for that. I want a 4-inch square when I'm through sewing, and so 4.5 inches will give me a 1/4-inch seam allowance on each side. I also cut 4.5-inch strips out of the rawhide stripe fat quarter. I'm taking one orange piece and one striped piece and putting them together, right sides together, and I'm just going to sew that with a 1/4-inch seam. And it would make it really fast if you chain piece these all together. I didn't, but I should have. I sewed them all, and then I took the pieces to my ironing board and opened them up with the seam going to one side, and then gave them a good steam pressing with my iron. And so now I'm ready to cut these into 4.5-inch pieces. Cut off the rough side so that you have a good clean side to measure from, and then I am just going to use my straight edge ruler, just marked at 4.5 inches, and cut out all these pieces. Strip piecing is what this is called, and it's a really easy way to sew squares together or get your squares for a quilt. And is this one going to be 4.5 inches wide? Yes, it is. I had just barely enough of the burnt orange fat quarter to make enough squares to do the pattern that I wanted to do. However, I did cut one of them wonky. I don't know how that happened because I thought I was being really careful. I'm just putting these together in sets of 2 right now so that I have one seam going left and one seam going right, so I'll be able to nest these tightly and get sharp points. Back at the sewing machine now, and I've grabbed one of those sets of 2s, and the right sides are facing, and that's how they'll need to be, but I'm just showing you how it needs to go so that we can get a checkerboard pattern, or what is called a 4-patch block. And if you've not matched up seams before, if you're a new or beginning quilter, take a few minutes. That's what I'm doing here. I am matching up the seams so that they're nice and tight and that they nest together, and then I put a pin in that. So I'm just going to do a 1/4 inch seam now, and then I will do all of them. They'll all be held together by the thread, and that is called chain piecing. I was going to edit this part out, but I didn't because I thought it was funny. I could not for the life of me get those 2 pieces of fabric separated so that I could make sure that they were even. If I had put the pin down that I was holding, I probably could have had more dexterity. Hit the thumbs up button if you feel like all thumbs sometimes when you're sewing. So I finally got them separated and then made sure that it was nested, and then I dropped my pin. So I was trying to find my pin here. That's why there's just this lovely footage of my sewing machine, and I found it. It had gone, slightly underneath the sewing machine. So we're all back on track now, and here I am sewing this one. I wanted to show you, but my phone cut out on it. On one of these sets that I sewed, I took too big of a seam allowance at the very end. And so when I do that, and I didn't pick it out first, so when I do that, I just go back over it. I tack it down at the point where it started, where the mistake starts, and then I make the proper seam allowance, and then I picked out the seam allowance that was too wide. Usually I will pick out the seam first and then resew it, but I was in a hurry, and there was just like an inch that needed to be redone. And voila, these turned out really good. I took them to the ironing board and gave them a good steam press. It didn't matter which way, whether the seams went left or right, because I will be sewing them onto straight, plain unsewn fabric. What I'm doing right now is measuring each 4-patch block to see if they measure up to 8.5 inches. And there's no shame in telling you that only one of them did. Okay, maybe a little bit of shame. But I have it on video, and you saw how careful I was at measuring and taking my time to get a correct measure on those strips. So what happened? I don't know what happened. This is something that always happens to me, so I don't know if it's just me or if it's just, being a beginner quilter, or I don't know what the deal is. But I'm going to show you how I fixed it. Now, I could have jumped in my car and driven back to 35th Avenue Fabrics, Fabric World, and gotten some more of the burnt orange fabric and started over to make sure that I got all of my squares at 8.5 inches. But I think that I still would have come up short on some of them. So like I said, I'm going to show you what I did. And you may approve, you may disapprove of it. But this is what I do so that I can quilt and not be frustrated all the time with it. Only one of them was 8.5-inch square, and the others were various measurements, but mostly 8 3/8 inch square. So I decided to square them up, square them down, so that they were all 8.25 inch square. And then I made my plain blocks out of fabric to be 8.25 inches. So the finished square sewn into the finished quilt is going to be less than 8 inches square. So I don't know if I can explain this right or not, but I took the square measures that I had here and I measured from the seam to the outside edge 4 1/8 inches and then trimmed it up. After I trimmed one side, I would turn the block and trim the next side so that I was trimming each side of each block to 4 1/8 inches from the middle seam to the edge. And Quilt Dog decided to join me here. And ironically, her name is Patchy. And I just think that that's a great name for a quilting companion. But I didn't name her. She came that way. She's my daughter's dog, and she was a rescue. And so she already had this name before we got her. And I know that some of you really enjoy seeing her in the background, so I didn't edit it out. And here's the stack of them ready to be sewn with the other blocks of fabric. But I will need to warn you about one thing that I was oblivious to. There was a major glitch, and I will show you that. It's coming up in a few minutes. In the meantime, I am cutting my unpieced fabric squares that I will be using between the 4 patches. So I am cutting 8 1/4 inch squares out of the vintage bandana navy blue. I just put a brand new blade in my rotary cutter, so I don't think that's the problem. I think I have old mats. So if you're having this problem, maybe that's why. So now I'm doing the same thing and making squares out of the rootin' tootin' fabric. Pardon me, I believe this is the saddle up fabric. I have this out on the kitchen table and I'm trying to hurry and get it all measured out so that I can get everything put away. I'm expecting my daughter to come in about 10 minutes for lunch, and so she doesn't know about this quilt. I'm trying to get it ready for her baby shower in a couple of weeks. So I want to get everything put away so that this can be a surprise for her. Now I have this laid out, all ready to sew it, and I'll let you look and see if you can figure out what's wrong with it. And I don't catch it before I sew it together, so there is a lot of unpicking that happened. I'm going to sew these 2 pieces right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam. Sometimes the needle veers off and doesn't make a true 1/4 inch seam. So when that happens, then I just go back over it so that the seam is even. I tack it down first and then just go back and make sure that it's 1/4 inch. At the ironing board, and I'm setting the seam first and then laying it out and giving everything a good steam press. And of course, being on camera, this one didn't work out as perfectly as I had hoped, or as perfectly as some of the others have worked out. So I just had to go back and just make sure that the seam was flat. I am lining up my seams here so that the first and second rows are going in different directions so that I can nest my seams well. So I am lining the seams up now and nesting them and then securing them with a pin, and then I will sew these rows together. Now that the 2 rows are pinned together, I'll sew them together. I got 4 rows of 4 blocks in each row, all sewed together. This is just showing 2 rows, but can you see or can you tell what the mistake was that I made? The 4 patch blocks are not going in the same direction. So I unpicked the blocks that were going in the direction that I didn't want them to, and it required another trip to Fabric World to get some more of the striped fabric, and then the fabric called Giddy Up, the burnt orange fabric with little cowboys and cowgirls on it. This is the whole line of that fabric. And it's so cute, I just love it. And I got a half a yard of each of these. So hopefully I won't make any more large mistakes and it will be enough. And just cutting out some more 4.5-inch strips to make some more 4-patch blocks. I'm going to be making 4.5-inch strips out of this fabric to use for a 4-inch border around the design of the quilt. And I'll be making a 1.5-inch strip for border out of this bandana material. Back at the sewing machine to sew the strips together. Then I took them to the ironing board and pressed them open, and then cut them into 4.5-inch lengths. I'm nesting the seams together and then sewing them with a 1/4-inch seam and chain piecing them like I did the other ones previously. Cutting the pieces apart, and then I took them to the ironing board and ironed them open. These are the last 2 rows that need to be sewn on the quilt. And I'm going crazy obsessing whether everything is going the right direction or not. Most of the intersections look good on this quilt. Some are a fraction off, but nothing to get too crazy excited about. I had a couple of lengths of the skinny border that were not long enough that I had to sew together, so I just did a regular 1/4-inch seam on that. I didn't want the fabric to be too stretchy, so I didn't do it diagonally. Here I am sewing the top and bottom skinny border on. That's in the bandana fabric. I pinned this really close together because I didn't want it to stretch, which is a problem when you've got a skinny piece of fabric. Here it is all pieced together, and you can see I have the top and bottom small border sewn on. I don't have it ironed or pulled back yet. When I finished sewing the top and the bottom skinny border, I trimmed it flush, and then I did the same thing after I sewed on the side borders. I took it to the cutting mat and evened it up and trimmed it flush, trimming off all the tails. Pinning right sides together now of the quilt and the 4-inch border. And I'll do the same with this as I did with the skinny border, sewing the top and bottom first, then pressing them open, trimming off the tails, and then I will do the sides and repeat the same procedure. And here it is, ready to be pinned and have the batting sandwiched in between that and the backing. I've got the backing for the quilt laying right side down on my family room floor, and I am going to tape it down with some packing tape. A week before I laid this quilt down, Quilt Dog was minding her own business, walking with her owners, and a big dog attacked her. So she is in a surgical suit and a cone for another week. Now I have laid down, sandwiched, and pinned many quilts on my family room floor, but for some reason I was struggling with this one. No matter which kind of tape I used painter's tape, masking tape, packing tape. Nothing would stick to the bottom layer, the backing. And the only thing that I can think of that was different this time was that I did not pre-wash my fabric. And I usually do that. And so I don't know, there may be some kind of substance that's on the fabric that will not stick to tape. I feel like every step of this quilt that I've done so far, I've done twice. So I don't even know why I'm showing you this process, but maybe somebody will find value in it somehow. So I ended up putting the batting on top of the back part that I had taped down onto the floor. And then on top of the batting, I put the top part of the quilt, the pieced part. And so right now I am taking my pins and I am pinning in the middle of each square, and then 4 times in the larger squares to pin the quilt together. But the quilt kept slipping out of the tape, and I noticed that when I took it up off of the floor that there was this huge wrinkle on the backing that had not been smoothed out or had slipped out. Since the backing had slipped out of the tape, it had appeared. And so the backing part was not flat and smooth. I ended up taking out all of the pins and then ironing the backing really well with steam. And you can see here that I can feel the wrinkle through the batting and the top. And I think that I'm smoothing it out, but I'm not. So that step of ironing the backing is really important, even though you think that you can make do without it. So with everything unpinned, I decided to take the top layer and the batting layer and trim the batting off so that I could see better once I put it onto the backing. There was really just a small amount of overhang from the backing to the front, and with the batting covering it up when it was on the floor, I was really afraid that I was not going to get it even. So here I am here with my straight edge and my rotary cutter, just going around all four edges and trimming that batting even with the top layer. And I'm deciding this time to work on my tabletop. So once I get the backing all steam ironed, I lay that out on my dining room table or my kitchen table. It's got a rough surface, so I'm not worried about scratching it. And I lay it out flat and even. And then I still have the batting kind of together with the, nothing's holding on to it, but the batting is together with the top piece. And so I add that to the backing and then I can go around the table and make sure that everything is even, that I have an even amount of overhang on each side. I had, especially the bottom layer, I had pulled as taut as I could, but it was not pulled and taped down like I normally like to do. But it's amazing how well everything stayed flat and looked nice after I had it quilted. So if you can't get down on the floor to pin your quilts, and if you don't have a large work table, this worked out nice enough. With everything flat and smooth, I can go ahead and pin it together again. And so I'm pinning 4 pins in each square. I'm now cutting 2.5-inch strips to make the binding. And I'm making it out of the same fabric as the backing. I had purchased 3 yards of this backing fabric, and I have about 1.5 yards left with about 1 yard width. If you've never made your own binding before, it's really easy after you've done it a few times. So I just take the 2 strips facing right sides together and perpendicular to one another and sew them diagonally. It's important to overlap the ends slightly because that is a guide for where you need to sew. And then once it's done, I check it, make sure that it's even, and then I'll trim the tags off or the corners off. Then once I have all the pieces sewn together, then I take it to the ironing board and fold it
in half
vertically and press it. And then I roll it up together so that it stays nice and doesn't get wrinkled. And then I have it when I need it.
So now I'm ready to quilt it on the machine, just on my sewing machine, and I'm going to start with the vertical lines first and start past the skinny border, tack it down, and then stitch in the ditch or the seam all the way down until I reach the end at the bottom. You may be able to see that on the blue plain blocks that I drew lines using my straight edge and a white chalk pencil. I drew straight lines so that I can stitch straight when I come to those parts. And then when the quilt is done, I will wash it to get the chalk out of it. So I'm going to sew all of the vertical lines now, and then also the horizontal lines. And I just wanted to mention that I changed my presser foot to a walking foot. Here are the lines that I was talking about that I drew with the ruler and the chalk pencil. It just made it really easy for me to stitch my lines straight with those lines there. I thought I had filmed it, but I guess I didn't. Once I got done making the squares in the middle, then I outlined the skinny border on the inside and the outside lines. I didn't put any additional quilting in the 4-inch border, but if I wanted to go back and do that, I can. And now I'm just going to even up the backing with the batting and the top layer with my straight edge and my rotary cutter. I'm attaching the binding to the quilt now by putting the raw edges on the edge of the quilt, pinning it, and having the folded edge facing the middle of the quilt. I did more like a 3/8 of an inch seam on this, but I think I'm going to go back to a 1/4 inch seam doing this. I ended up having to trim everything, and if I had done a 1/4 inch seam, I wouldn't have had to trim. The other thing I like to mention when I do these videos and I'm attaching the binding is that I always leave a good 6 to 8 inches unattached before I start sewing. So there's a tail or there's this big flap of binding that isn't pinned, and that helps when you go to sew the binding together at the very end when you're done stitching it all through the quilt. If you start sewing it down right at the end or the end of the binding, you won't be able to sew it to the other part when you're done. And if you leave a small part unattached, it makes it very difficult. So leave about 6 to 8 inches not pinned down that are just going to be loose when you go to sew the ends together. And it will become more clear when you see me attach the two ends together. I'm going to just sew this to about 1/4 of an inch at the bottom of this side of the quilt. And then I will stop the sewing machine and put the needle down into the fabric, lift up the presser foot, and pivot the fabric so that there's a diagonal line from the needle to the point end of the fabric. And then I'll go ahead, put the presser foot back down, and sew it off of the edge. I forgot to mention that I started sewing the binding about 1/3 to 1/2 away down from the top of the quilt. So now watch closely how I fold the binding. It's making a diagonal line underneath, and it's even, the fold is even with the top of the quilt. And I'm going to pin that in place. And I'm actually going to pin the rest of the binding down to give me more control as I'm sewing. So now I'm going to resume sewing the binding on the new side, starting 1/4 of an inch from the top, or just until it clears that fold that's underneath. And so I tack it down and continue sewing my 3/8 of an inch seam, or you may want to use a 1/4 inch seam. And I just keep on doing this until I go all the way around the quilt and return to the beginning. At the corner, stop 1/4 inch away, put the needle down into the fabric, lift up the presser foot, pivot the fabric until the needle is facing the point or the end. Put the presser foot back down and sew off the edge. I've gone all the way around now, and I've given myself, about 10 inches maybe, without any stitching. And so I am just going to lay the binding down. I'm laying the beginning piece down, and I'm going to snip a little bit off so it will lay flat. And then I'm going to bring the end piece over on top of it. And since I have a 2.5 inch binding before it was folded, I am going to measure 2.5 inches of overlap from the beginning and the ending piece. And I have my ruler marked at 2.5 inches so I can see it well. So watch me as I lay that down and measure it from the bottom, and then I am going to clip the top piece that overlaps at 2.5 inches. It's always a little nerve-wracking making that cut. Now watch as I put the beginning piece and the end piece together. I am going to overlap them right sides facing, perpendicular, with just a tiny bit of overlap, and then sew it the same way I did the binding by sewing from corner to corner. Now you're going to feel like you're struggling with this, but just take your time, make sure everything's flat and everything's lined up, and it's going to work out great. And this is the reason why you left so much, or why I left so much of the binding unsewn from the beginning and at the end, so that I would have this much to play with and make it easier to get it flat. I'm just going to sew this from corner to corner now. If you need to mark a line with a pen, you just go right ahead. And voila. Check it first to see if it lines up with your quilt. If it does, then go ahead and cut the corners off. Flatten them out with a little bit of a finger press. And then go ahead and line them up with the edge of your quilt and sew it on. See how easy that was? That couldn't have worked out better if I tried. And there you go. I didn't film it, but after I did this, I went ahead and I brought the binding over to the back, pinned it down, and sewed it by hand. I ended up not being able to finish this on time. There were things that happened, and I was helping to get ready for the shower, and so I didn't get all the sewing done. I didn't give it to her at the shower with her other gifts. And I'm also waiting for something to come in the mail from an Etsy shop also to go along with this. But it's okay. Sometimes these things happen, and if there's emergency situations, those take precedence over quilts. And I told my daughter, or I actually showed her the quilt, and she was very excited and happy about it. This is before I sewed the binding down, and this is after the finished product. We had a very nice baby shower. There were lots of people there, and there were some that came that we hadn't seen in a while. So that was very nice. The final measurements to this quilt are 42 inches by 50. We are very excited about the upcoming birth and preparing for that. We are more prepared than we were, but she's getting the last things together that she needs. I wanted to mention before closing, since it was about 2 weeks since I last showed Quilt Dog, that she's doing much better. She needed a second surgery, but she's going to make a full recovery. She's back to jumping up and down and doing all the things Jack Russell Terriers do. This was a very long video, and I thank you for watching. Put a shout out in the comments section if you made it to the very end. I don't think many will. I had wanted to put a tag on this blanket because it was a special blanket, but I hadn't ever put tags on my quilts before, and so I wasn't quite sure how to do it. So I experimented one afternoon using a scrap piece of fabric and some of the pens that I already had. I wrote on the fabric in different pens, labeling which pen it was, and then I washed it in my washing machine with detergent, and I was able to compare how it did in the washing machine. I feel like out of all of these that the thin Sharpie worked the best, but still up close you could see where it had bled a little. It just wasn't a crisp and sharp line. I had these purchased labels, but they're an iron-on label, and I just didn't know if they would stay, how well they would stay on. So then I thought that maybe I would embroider the tag by using a friction pen, which is a pen, the one I have, it will, the ink will disappear when it's exposed to air for a long period of time. So after I wrote on some fabric, then I was going to go over it and embroider it with embroidery floss. But I didn't really care for that either. So then I decided to use some Aida cloth that I had and embroider a message on that. I embroidered my message and then cut down the cloth and added sides with the fabric, the backing fabric, and then a top to it, and pressed down the edges and then sewed it by hand onto the quilt.
on the back side of the quilt. Now, I've put off loading this video onto YouTube because I was waiting for something to come in the mail. I ordered a cute little set of booties that look like cowboy boots, and they're crocheted. And I ordered them about a month ago, but they haven't come yet. But when they come, I'll do just a short clip video and show them with the quilt. They're so cute, and you'll just love them. And I know my daughter will love them also. But again, thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Have a good day and goodbye.